Yeah, so I'm Jake Erickson, a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Climate Action Lab. And this is looking at the disparities in electrification accessed by heat pumps across the United States. So this work is really motivated, obviously, by an interest in climate and energy justice, and particularly an interest in understanding the equity implications of this transition to building electrification. As we start getting more and more electric appliances and systems in our buildings, who is benefiting from that or is able to benefit from that, and who's really missing out. Prior research has really demonstrated that energy efficiency hasn't really reached the really vulnerable populations in our communities. And so we wanted to see if that applied for electrification as well and see what that might say for the future of electrification and decarbonization in America. So we're looking specifically at heat pumps. We'll get into a little bit of what that is, and looking really at racial disparities in the adoption of heat pumps across the country, and specifically looking to see if there's injustice implications emerging from the data that we're able to observe. So we use really granular data on households individually across the country, and also some interesting non-parametric and simulation approaches here. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what a heat pump is, it's basically an air conditioner that can run backwards. They're super efficient when you compare them to things like furnaces and boilers and everything up to like 400 times efficient. But they also depend on the weather. So if it's really, really cold outside, they're not going to be as efficient. So there's actually disparities in how effective they are at saving money over time. The data that we use for this analysis largely comes from Zillow, Z-Trax. So that's household level attribute data. We have socioeconomic data from the census, utility data on prices, the whole 9 yards. The map you see there is actually the distribution of heat pumps at the county level across the country, so you can kind of get an idea of what we're working with. So we start off with a household level analysis at the country level, so this is including all of those households in this data set. On the right-hand side, you can see sort of our control variables, things that we would generally expect to affect the performance of heat pumps and the likelihood of adopting them. So it's building age, the extreme weather, those HDD and CDD weather data points, and electricity and gas prices. And on the left here, you see those racial predictors of heat pump adoption. This is a simple logit model, so this is relative likelihood of adoption compared to the baseline, which is white households. And basically what we see is that in census tracts with higher proportions of minority identities, you are less likely as an individual household to adopt a heat pump. Okay, so we already see some sort of significant pattern going on here that may suggest some sort of inequities. So then we want to dive into this a little further and look at specifically community patterns in the adoption of heat pumps across income levels. So what we did is we aggregated things up to the census tract level and looked specifically at census tracts with a majority of a given identity. So these are 50% or more of the population that identify as a given racial identity here. And then we looked at how the adoption likelihood tracked with different income levels, the median tract level income in this case. And we see very different trends and patterns between different majority racial tract groups. So that blue line there, which is white majority census tracts, kind of peaks out at around a median tract level income of about $60,000 and then tapers back off. Whereas black majority census tracts sort of has that continuing increase in adoption as income rises, and you can see the various trends for other racial groups there as well. But now to get at this sort of idea of injustice, we really need to understand whether people are being prevented from accessing a benefit or pushed into something that incurs a cost. So we introduced this sort of simple framework where if you are in an area where adopting a heat pump would result in you having a net cost, and your racial identity significantly predicts that you will adopt a heat pump, that's kind of a problem. Or on the other side, if you live in an area where having a heat pump would incur a net benefit and your racial identity negatively predicts the adoption of that technology, that's also a problem. So we ran a Monte Carlo simulation, and we're basically able to, at the county level, label the areas that were these net costs and net benefits. Green, net benefit, you can kind of get the idea. 90% or more of those simulations come out saying, yep, there's a net benefit, call it green. Red for those net costs, and then gray is kind of anything that lies in the middle. So quite a disparity there. You can also see how it lines up with the relative primary fuel type for heating across the country. And so then it was pretty simple. We just ran that same regression in each of those three areas, looking again at those same predictors. And this is looking at specifically those racial identity predictors at the tract level within those 3 areas. So what we see here is that if you are in a tract with a higher proportion of minority identities in one of these green areas, in these net benefit areas, you're less likely to adopt a heat pump. So here we see racial identity significantly predicting the lower likelihood of adopting a technology that would actually give a net benefit. On the other side, in the net costs, yeah, there's the little stars there, but if we look at the magnitudes, the changes are really, really tiny, so we kind of can look aside from that. But we don't really see that difference unless you're Native American. And so this is actually a really interesting point. If you're living in an area with a higher Native American population that is also an area where you would incur net costs from adopting a heat pump, you are significantly more likely than your white counterparts to adopt a heat pump. So you're actually being pushed in a sort of way, statistically pushed, into adopting a heat pump, something that would incur a net cost for you. So there is this sort of cause for concern in this transition. Early on, heat pumps aren't that widely adopted across the country. Places like around here, actually, they're quite common, but in much of the rest of the country, it's a really early stage market. But we're already starting to see these racial patterns, these racial biases in access to beneficial heat pumps, which is definitely cause for concern. We also see that there are racial differences in the way that folks and communities interact with the adoption of heat pumps as income grows, whether or not they are more or less likely to adopt it at different levels, which may have implications for how we incentivize, how we drive the adoption of these efficient technologies over time. And so as with much of the stuff that we talk about here, there's definitely need for further research to really identify the mechanisms, what's going on here, and really clear the path for an equitable electrification future.